Manhattan Neighborhood Network, in partnership with the League of Women Voters of New York State, presents Race to Represent, a MNN election initiative. Manhattan Neighborhood Network, in partnership with the League of Women Voters of New York State, presents Race to Represent, a MNN election initiative. Hello, I'm Julie Walker. New Yorkers will be voting in the general election on Tuesday, November 6th. They will be casting their ballots for offices including governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, comptroller, state assembly, and state senator. The New York State Senate is the upper house of the New York State Legislature. Its 63 members represent New York State and its more than 19 million citizens. The legislature's primary purpose is to draft and approve changes to the laws of New York. Today, we bring you a debate with the candidates running for State Senate in District 27, which covers Hell's Kitchen, Chelsea, Greenwich Village, the Upper West Side, Midtown, East Midtown, Columbus Circle, Times Square, Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village, the East Village, and the Lower East Side. The winner of this race will take office in January of 2019. Joining us now is the Democratic candidate and incumbent, Brad Hoylman, and the Republican challenger, Ashton Randle. Welcome, and thank you both for being here. State Senator Brad Hoylman, let's start with you. What 3 words would you use to describe yourself that make you the better candidate?
Thank you, Julie, first of all, and MNN and the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this important debate. These conversations across our city and state and country are so important at this time. The 3 words I would describe myself would be persistent. I think I'm someone who, when they see an issue, they go for it and they continue to make progress. Even though I've been blocked time and time again by a Republican state Senate, I'm going to try to pass important bills like the Child Victims Act, for example, to raise the statute of limitations. Secondly, I would say caring, because at the end of the day, that's really government's responsibility. My role as a public official isn't to look out for the top 1% of our economy. It's to look at the most vulnerable, those in our society who don't have a place to live, who are hungry, who can't get their kids in the right school, or can't get to work on time because of the subway delays and the infrastructure that seems to be collapsing around us. And then third, I would say progressive, because really this is a moment in our history in the country that it's time for Americans to stand up for what they believe in terms of progressive values. We have to fight Donald Trump, the right wing, and the madness, really, that is being imposed on our country and our state. And for that reason, I think I'm the better candidate, but also the candidate that I hope will continue to fight for change in Albany.
We're getting those important issues a bit later in the debate, but let's go to your challenger now, Ashton Randle. What 3 words would you use to describe yourself that identify you as a better candidate? And along with that, what makes you the right choice over your opponent?
Well, as I would like to also reiterate, we appreciate you having this forum, allowing us to kind of discuss our ideas and our differences. For me, actually, advocate, strong advocate, which is 2 words, but it is one statement. I have been working in the public policy space for over almost 20 years, and one thing I believe is the fact that we need to bring effective public policy to government at all levels. The other one would be inquisitive. In looking at public policy, you need to go beyond the top levels of what is in the rhetoric and media besides just education and taxation. I think we need to go farther and looking and see what issues are really impacting the lives of people on a daily basis in here. I don't think that rhetoric out of D.C. is the focus of the 27th District. I think that we need to be focusing on trash and cleaning streets. And then also, I would say that resilience and just always willing to work to push forward with regards to issues and trying to make sure that lives are better for people in all communities that are in my district, in the state, and in the country.
So what is the major issue facing District 27, and what policy proposals do you want to pursue to address it?
Well, one thing, obviously, I believe is the trash and cleaner streets is one thing that we really need to focus on. In addition to NYCHA, or the public housing, and the MTA. Looking at the sanitation issue, we have contracts in all these other places that have not been reviewed, that have no real oversight. We literally see that we have trash trucks going up the wrong side of the streets, or not even going up streets at all, and leaving our facilities where our children are playing in disarray, and also leaving trash on the streets that is not giving us a clean city. MTA, we really need to look at how we can revamp.
Let me stop you right there. We're going to get to the MTA in a moment, but you mentioned trash and cleaner streets. What policy proposals do you want to pursue to address it?
Audits. We really need to be looking at audits for DS, New York's Department of Sanitation, looking at who's getting paid, who's getting these contracts, and where the money is going.
Okay, and now to you, State Senator, what is the major issue facing your district, and what policy proposal do you want to pursue to address it?
Well, Julie, there are so many issues that impact the 27th district. It's an incredibly diverse district. You know, we have some of the richest neighborhoods on the west side, with the Hudson Yards development springing up now, to Greenwich Village, to the East Village, and up to East Midtown. We also have a great number of rent-regulated apartments within that incredibly rich tapestry of cultural and mass transit and economic assets. We have about 50,000 rent-regulated units here in the 27th Senate District. And what concerns me most of all is the war on tenants that's occurring right now as we speak by landlords trying to force rent-regulated tenants out of their homes. These are New Yorkers who have built so many neighborhoods. The neighborhood like where Ashton lives in Hell's Kitchen was built by a number of rent-regulated tenants who actually were pioneers in an area that a lot of people didn't want to live, where a lot of people didn't want to live 20 years ago. Now it's one of the most prosperous. If we don't renew the rent laws in Albany and strengthen them at the same time by ending vacancy decontrol, by eliminating luxury decontrol, by stopping tenants from being charged for improvements that are already paid for out of their rent, and by making certain that the harassment that occurs day in and day out. You know, the other day I got a call from a tenant whose landlord is reconstructing their entire lobby, and the intention, which is pretty obvious, is to make that tenant's life miserable. So he or she will take the buyout that the landlord is dangling in front of this tenant's face. Well, tenants have to fight back. So if I were to say the most important issue in the 27th Senate District, it would be protecting rent stabilization, making certain that the members, the residents of the 27th Senate District are able to stay in their home and continue to prosper and make this neighborhood what it has been for decades.
So let's stick with you for a moment, and then we'll get...
I was going to ask to rebuttal just a statement about that.
Okay.
One of the things, I 100% agree with you, that we need to look at the housing issue, because that is a critical part, especially within the 27th District. But I also think that we need to look at what it is that tenants and landlords need to do together, because we actually... everyone knows that there are these rules and regulations around what rights tenants have and what rights landlords have, but I don't think that either of them really truly understand. So I actually, looking at housing, would really propose a tenant-landlord Bill of Rights, very similar to what we have with Patients' Bill of Rights, Passengers' Bill of Rights, and really codifying that into one location in one place that we can really address a lot of these issues, so that, as you were talking about your example, we can really address some of these issues and make sure that tenants and landlords are both equitably treated.
Could I just follow up on
Yes.
that? I'll say something that is probably not terribly controversial, which is money talks in Albany. And the reason we have to protect tenants not landlords, is because landlords go up to Albany every year, and because of something called the LLC loophole, they are able to contribute essentially unlimited amounts of money to the Republican Senate conference. And it happens time and time again. They use these phony corporate shells, which are treated as individuals under New York State election law, to contribute hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to their favorite candidates. And that results in this imbalance between tenants and landlords. So it's not the landlords who need a Bill of Rights, all due respect. It's tenants who need a leg up, who need support, who need the rent laws reauthorized but strengthened. And next year is the critical year that the state Senate needs to do that, and that's why it's so important that we elect a Democratic state Senate. For decades, the Senate Republicans have ignored the needs of New York City tenants because, let's face it, they don't represent many of them. The Senate chair of the Housing Committee, a Republican, lives closer to Montreal than Manhattan. So what does she care about New York City tenants? We have to win the Senate back for the Democratic Conference, and that's what we're going to do, hopefully in November, and we're going to strengthen those rent laws come the new session.
I want to give you a chance to rebut if you have something to say, but I don't want to stay on housing
topic,
for the whole debate.
I think we can easily say that there's money in politics on both sides. We cannot just say that Republicans are the only ones using loopholes, helping with tenants or helping with landlords. I do think that there are some reforms that need to be addressed and looked at in Albany, but coming down here, I think that we really need to look and see how we can bring these two groups together to make an equitable fix. You know, as you do, I 100% agree. I mean, having a background in Washington, I've seen the way that money does influence politics. But I do think that the purpose of our job is to make sure that we can bring our constituents together, whether they're landlords or tenants, to really address those grievances. So I do think that that's another conversation. Instead of saying, blaming Republicans, I think, you know, we should be able to work with Republicans and Democrats to address those loopholes.
Let's talk about the MTA, something you mentioned before, and we'll stay with you, Mr. Randle. New York's public transit crisis has been decades in the making. How should the state move forward, and do you support the MTA Fast Forward plan?
I do think that there need to be some addresses, some significant reforms. The Fast Forward plan, I do think, needs to have some additional review. In my opinion, I think the city should look at taking control of the system. We also need some procurement reforms, looking at where the contracts are coming from, looking at the funding along those lines. I think that looking at the budgets, and that's really going to be where we're going to be able to make some significant changes. In addition, looking at potentially just new management and looking at ways to overhaul the way that the system in MTA is actually operating.
Mr. Hoylman?
Well, I strongly support the Fast Forward plan. It's really the first real review we've had in a decade or longer of the MTA. You know, there's something called the state of good repair, and that means, are we putting enough money into the MTA just to make certain that the trains run on time and the repairs are made? And the fact is, we're not. Here's the thing about the Fast Forward plan. It's going to cost us $40 billion. Now, I also support congestion pricing, but with the bonds that will raise, that's about $20 billion of the plan. We got to come up with the remaining $20 billion. So that's going to require a very, very intense focus from both houses in the legislature and the governor. We have to do better. We have to put more money into the MTA. By neglecting it for these years, by literally siphoning money from the MTA that was due the Transit Authority, we've seen what has happened. Julie, I was late to this debate because of the A train being stuck at West 4th. We've heard that time and time again from New Yorkers. It's the single most repeated request I get when I'm campaigning on the streets of the 27th Senate District. Fix the subway. That's our mandate to do that in Albany, but we gotta have the courage and the resolve to raise the revenue to do it.
The only thing I would add to that is the fact of the matter is I don't think that we can constantly just spend our way to a MTA fix. And while we were talking about there is a $20 billion that we have to raise, I think that we also really have to examine what is being spent. And I think that that is the important thing first before we just move forward with these projects. And I think that we've seen in a lot of other opportunities, and a lot of other things, that is a problem that we've been seeing happen, that a lot of people are excited about these programs. They list all these billion-dollar programs, and no one knows what's in it.
If I could just follow up. We've been essentially abandoned by the federal government when it comes to our mass transit. Donald Trump just essentially has canceled plans for federal support for the single most important infrastructure project in the region, which is the Hudson Tunnel. I was proud to sponsor and pass legislation in Albany that would allow that project to go forward, but we're going to have to figure out how to move a lot of people from New Jersey to New York City, and we're going to do it without much federal support, it seems, at this point. So it is important to look at new revenue streams. I hope you support congestion pricing. That's $20 billion of the plan, but there's the other $20 billion that's hanging out there. And so this is going to be a time that Democrats, working with Governor Cuomo, are going to have to take a hard look at the numbers. Again, the state Senate in Albany, controlled by Republicans, has been neglectful of MTA issues. When we try to talk about raising money for our subways, they complain about their bridges and highways. Well, here's the fact. For every dollar that Albany gets from New York City only gets 60 cents back. We've been robbed for years by Albany because money has been siphoned from our city and redistributed to the rest of the state. We've got to realign that formula and make certain that the economic engine, which is New York City, gets its fair share from Albany.
I want to give you a chance to rebut, but I need to ask you about congestion pricing because that was a separate issue, and the state senator brought it up, and I didn't get to ask you about it.
I do agree with congestion pricing, and I do think that that's going to be a way to start, the engine to kind of get more money into the system. And yes, so that is true. But going back into saying what you're mentioning about the president and kind of what he's blocking, I think that as we've seen with the president out of Washington, which, he is a very business and focus-oriented person, he has not been fully fully vested and also aware about what it is that they're going to be using the money for. We noticed that the way he operates is the fact is like he wants to know detail-oriented plans. You can't just go to Washington and say, I just need this because this tunnel's broken. I have yet to honestly see any real concrete detail in line-by-line audit on besides Governor Cuomo and the Democrats saying, well, we just need more money from the federal government.
If I could just follow up on Trump and the war he seems to have proclaimed on New York State. His tax plan that gives the richest enormous tax breaks is going to cost New York State an estimated $17.5 billion. New York State taxpayers an estimated $17.5 billion in their taxes this spring. That's an average of over $5,000 per taxpayer, and that includes middle class and lower income folks. So it's not just enough to say that, in fact, I'd say it's incorrect to say that Donald Trump is a businessman focused on results. He's a politician who's spreading lies about New York's needs and at the same time demonizing the sectors of our society, whether it be the press, immigrants, LGBT people, and women, to an extent that we on this stage cannot support anything from the White House. When they talk about resistance, I think you're talking about Democrats and hopefully courageous Republicans who stand up to Trump and his misdeeds.
Speaking about New York needs, I think we need to get back on track here and talking about the needs of your constituents. How do you suggest or plan to encourage and keep local business owners in your district? Do you support cuts to the commercial tax? We'll start with you, Mr. Randle.
I do think that we need to actually look. I'm actually more feel that we really need to look at more business partnerships with community organizations and corporate social responsibility programs, bringing together businesses and local communities. I would need to want to examine more about the tax to see what the full impacts are down the line. But we really need to look at, especially in our district, where you have storefronts closing, you have empty lots, you have housing issues and things of that nature. With regards to business, those are the things that I'm really more focused on, and trying to get people and business and other organizations together to address those issues.
State Senator Hoylman?
I most certainly do. In fact, it was the City Council last year that passed an exemption for businesses in Manhattan who, for whatever reason, historically are being charged the commercial rent tax where other businesses are not. To eliminate it altogether would cost the city quite a considerable sum, but at the same time we have to do something to figure out how to save these storefronts. I did a report in my office where we showed a stretch of Bleecker Street and Chelsea had about 1/5 of storefronts as being vacant. We need to look at different steps, including proposals like instituting a legacy business support program for businesses that are historic to the neighborhood. They should have special assistance and special consideration. We need to help small businesses with their leases. I wish our city small business services had a form lease for tenants, not just for landlords, but also for tenants. And I wish they could provide ongoing legal assistance. When a small business's lease expires, sometimes the owner throws his hands up and says, I can't fight back any longer. And then finally, we need to figure out how to encourage people to shop locally. You know, part of this problem is, of course, landlords and the skyrocketing rents, where businesses are forced out. Another part of the problem is the fact that a lot of people are purchasing items online, and our shopping habits have changed. For those small businesses that are in the neighborhood, and we seem to be running out of them, whether it be the shoe store or the dry cleaner, we have to provide assistance. That's government's responsibility.
Okay, we gave you a little extra time.
I was going to say, we do agree on something. I do agree on the legacy aspect of that, because I do think that we see a lot of stores that are really becoming part of these communities that are literally losing their leases and losing their culture within the communities for other businesses that are corporate. And we do need to work on including that into kind of our plans for looking at revitalization of areas.
If I could just add, next week the City Council is considering something called the Small Business Survival Act, which has like mandated arbitration between small businesses and landlords. We should look at that seriously. That's something that can be done at the city level.
Let's move on to the Reproductive Health Act. The Reproductive Health Act, which would codify Roe versus Wade into state law, has been stuck in the Senate, stuck in the state Senate. If reelected, what are your feelings about getting this bill out?
Well, it's really a heartbreaking story for a lot of New York women, the fact that in New York, we're reliant on Roe versus Wade for our reproductive health laws. The laws in New York State haven't been updated since the early 1970s. So here's the concern. With Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, and I know we don't want to talk about federal issues, but what happens in Washington matters in New York, and here's a good example. If Roe is repealed in Washington, New York will no longer have their laws to protect reproductive health to the 24th week. We actually need to expand our reproductive health laws, codify them, not in the criminal statutes where they currently are, but in the civil statutes. And I've heard this story, and it really is quite upsetting. A young couple had a pregnancy that was difficult, and they were told by their physician that the baby would be born but not live much long after birth. The woman's health was in danger. She couldn't get an abortion in New York State because it was beyond 24 weeks. They actually had to fly to California with the woman carrying her unborn baby for that medical procedure. That's not right, and we need to fix the law in New York State for women and for families.
You're in the state Senate. The act is stuck in the state Senate. So what would you do to get it unstuck?
We'll win the Senate. The Democrats will win the Senate. I wouldn't say it's stuck in the state Senate. It's never had a vote in the state Senate. It's never had a hearing in the state Senate. We need to win a Democratic majority because the Republicans have shown us for the last 40-odd years that they do not support a woman's right to choose. There used to be a thing called the Rockefeller Republican, and there are apparently some Republicans who still support a woman's right to choose, but they're not legislating their conviction. They're not letting the bill be considered. So, Julie, the answer, very simply put, is when a Democratic state Senate will pass the Women's Reproductive Health Act and make certain that women are protected in New York State.
Mr. Randle.
Oh, well, mine would be very short, so you don't have to worry about that. I think that we have made it very, very simple that Roe is the law of the land. Constantly, we see Democrats always trying to introduce more and more legislation to just constantly bog down the system without doing effective public policy making. And in the case of the Reproductive Act, I think it's another attempt to just try to basically put Republicans in this anti-women's movement box, which is not the case. Most Republicans, and some of them, especially progressive Republicans like myself, while we are pro-life, we do believe that women, when it comes to abortion and when the life of the mother and child are at risk, that those need to be rape and incest as well need to be taken into consideration. But when the fact of the matter is that we do have law in the land, that Roe is the law of the land. That's it. That's all we need.
So if the bill comes up and you are elected to the state Senate, how would you vote on it?
I don't think we need miscellaneous laws that are already in state law of the land.
So
I would vote no.
Let's move on to the environment. That's a big issue. What are three of the biggest concerns when it comes to New York City's environment, and how do you plan to tackle those issues? We'll go back to you, Mr. Hoylman.
Thank you, Julie. You know, one of the major concerns, I think, that New Yorkers share with, I think, most right-thinking Americans is human-induced climate change. And in the state of New York, we haven't taken the steps that we need to do at the legislative level to combat that. You know, every state has to do its fair share to reduce carbon emissions, to bring us to 100% reliance on renewable sources of fuel. California is headed that direction, but because of the Republican state Senate, we haven't been able to get a hearing or a vote on the major climate change legislation in Albany, which is the Climate and Community Protection Act. I carry that legislation, so I'm very proud of it. It would not only move New York to 100% renewables, but also protect workers and other vulnerable people from the impacts of climate change. We saw after Superstorm Sandy, the people that were hurt the most weren't the people on Park Avenue or Billionaires Row. It were the vulnerable communities on the Lower East Side of my district who had their public housing flooded and their boilers blown out. I just visited one yesterday. Secondly, in addition to climate change, we still have to focus on making certain that fracking waste is banned from New York State. In New York State, you can still transport fracking waste across our borders, and that's a real problem for local communities, upstate in particular, that use some of this fracking waste to lay on roads during snowstorms. Hard to believe, but that's true. And then third, I would say what's incredibly important with our natural resources is just not far from here, the Hudson River. And I've been working very hard to make certain that PCBs are eliminated, that testing occurs up and down the length of the river, and mostly that the company responsible for dumping those cancer-causing agents pay for the entire cleanup. There's the principle that I want to see into New York law, which is polluters must pay, not the public. We've seen it in places like Hoosick Falls, where the public ends up shouldering most of the bill, but it should have been the company that did the polluting. So as our infrastructure ages, as we learn more about chemicals in our water and in industrial sites, we need to make certain that the historic polluters are on the hook. We have potential love canals all across the state of New York, and we need to be very aggressive in making certain that our local communities are protected and that the cleanup occurs not at the cost of the taxpayers.
Mr. Randle?
Well, I have to say the one thing when it comes to the environment, I think we always have to go to the experts. And in my opinion, in working in public policy, I think that unfortunately government has really been working to just go ahead and take ideas without looking at experts, without working with other entities to find out what are the best common sense solutions to either looking at green spaces, looking at carbon emissions, business, community service organizations, neighborhood organizations, all need to come together to tackle these issues at once to make sure that there's equitable results. As you mentioned, I agree with you that we do need to look at what's going on with the water that's happening in the city in the Hudson River. We do need to look at some green spaces that are happening with carbon emissions and things of that nature. I think in climate change, those are things that need to continue to be studied and continue to figure out the best way for business and for organizations to come together and address those issues in a common sense, effective public policy way.
Let me just add to that, which is...
We actually have to get to closing
Okay. I'll
statements.
just
And
say
if you'd
something.
like to put it in your closing statement, you can.
Absolutely.
So let's start with you.
The MTA recently purchased 200 diesel buses for the L Tunnel shutdown. It's an example, I think, of bureaucratic ignorance about the need for us to move to sustainable forms of transportation. But I'll say to the voters of the 27th Senate District how honored I've been to serve you for the last 6 years and how eager I am to continue my work in Albany, mostly because I think we're on the cusp of real change. In Albany there have been ethics violations, there have been a lack of attention to real societal needs, whether it be reproductive health, which we discussed, or LGBTQ rights. It's still legal in the state of New York for licensed therapists to try to convert a gay kid's sexuality. That's unacceptable. But because of the Republican Senate, they have blocked issues like that. Not to mention the other issues we talked about, rent regulation and making certain that tenants can stay in their home, or ensuring that our MTA is fixed. The lack of attention to the MTA over decades is, I would argue, political malpractice, and it's time for the politicians to step up and to fix that. With ethics reform, with focus on our infrastructure, including mass transit and our public school teachers, and making certain that we have a fair society that protects women's health, that passes a single-payer health care for New Yorkers, and that makes certain that vulnerable communities, whether they be LGBTQ kids or whether they be immigrants, are protected. I'm hopeful that we can do that with a change in Albany. Change is on the way. I'm hopeful that I'm going to be part of it. Let's elect a Democratic state Senate and make Andrea Stewart-Cousins the first African-American woman to head a legislative chamber in Albany. Thank you, and I appreciate your consideration.
And now on to your challenger, Ashton Theodore Randle. Your closing statement, please.
Well, thank you again for having us here today. I have to say that we've had a spirited debate. I think we're both great men with great ideas, just coming to the fore in different ways. If you really look back, and I always say you either take Ronald Reagan's approach, what have you done? Were you better 4 years from now, from then, or are you better 4 years today? Or Janet Jackson's approach, which what have you done for me lately? I think that we can see that there's a lot of things that have not changed in the 6 years that my opponent has been in office. And I really believe that we do need to have change, and we do need to continue to have a Republican Senate with a higher majority that can tackle the issues that are really impacting the 27th District. We look at issues around the MTA, we look around sanitation, we look around economic growth. Those are things, seniors, vulnerable populations, things that we really can tackle here at the 27th. One of the things that I really wanted to get a chance to talk about was we have an aging caregiving population that has risen children who have mental and physical disabilities, that their caregivers are growing from labor to reward and are not able to have transitional planning. We need to have a transitional planning programs working with corporate social responsibility and business to make those families safe and make sure those populations don't become the next people on the subway and the streets. I think that those partnerships are impacting the district directly, and that's where my focus is. Not taking the fight to Donald Trump and not taking it to D.C. We were going to be focusing here on the 27th District and the impact and the issues that are impacting us daily and annually. So in looking forward to November 6th, I'm excited to have you with your vote and your support. And appreciate everything you guys done today.
Thank you both. I want to thank all the candidates for participating in today's debate, and thank you for watching. Please remember to vote. The general election is on Tuesday, November 6th. For more information on voting, locating your polling site, and all the candidates, you can visit our website, racetorepresent.com, or the League of Women Voters website, lwvny.org. Thank you for watching Race to Represent on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.